Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tali Dippold, and I'm the new Executive Director of the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. We're thrilled to have you here with us this afternoon. The mission of the center in Florida is to use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to build a just and caring community free of anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice and bigotry. Through our extensive outreach of educational and cultural programs and exhibits, we use the lessons of the Holocaust as a tool to teach about good citizenship to thousands of people of all ages, races, religions, sexual orientations, abilities, and backgrounds each year. We're thrilled to welcome you to our program, In My Own Words. This is a virtual event series that is presented and we have many incredible past episodes. We invite you to visit our Facebook page and our website to hear remarkable stories. But we want to move on to our guest for today, because I think that's why we're all here, to enjoy. So I have the pleasure of introducing Mark Newhouse. And Mark Newhouse was born in Germany to Holocaust survivors, and he shares his journey of living with his parents' experiences through personal anecdotes, humor, and dramatic readings, which have been called a tribute to the immutable human spirit. Mark relates how he rediscovered his history and wrote his award-winning The Devil's Bookkeeper trilogy, which is a suspenseful and hope-filled series of novels set during the Holocaust. I hope you've had a chance to read them. If not, you're in for a treat. In fact, we're thrilled to announce that the third book, the third book just won an additional award among many, first place from Top Shelf magazine. So we're really thrilled to welcome Mark here. He's a former Long Island teacher, named as New York State Reading Association's Teacher of the Year in 1989. And he serves as a teacher trainer for New Day and as an adjunct instructor at SUNY Old Westbury. Currently, he's a member of the Board of Directors and Youth Program Chairperson of the Florida Writers Association. And I do want to let you know that we will have time at the end for a question and answer session, where we'll be joined by Mark's son, Keith, the author of My Tio's Pulse, an award-winning children's book inspired by the Pulse nightclub tragedy. So we're very fortunate to have Mark and Keith. They're a dynamic father-son duo, social activists, each one committed to championing the message that love is stronger than hate. We feel very aligned with his message. So thank you so much, Mark. We're so honored to have you here. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark Newhouse. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored to be sharing a message of love and hope that I think will be hopefully a tribute to the survivors and victims of not only the Holocaust, but of all hate and genocide, past, present, and future. As a classroom teacher, I always started my lessons with a joke. So you're about to suffer the world's worst joke. Now, let me warn you, this joke, I used to be able to make last 3 days for my students. So here goes. There is a man, and he is lost in a desert. And all he can think about is the fact that he's going to die if he doesn't get water. So as he's crawling through the desert, a man comes along on a camel. And this man in the desert says, "Oh my gosh, water, water." And the man on the camel says, "I'm sorry, sir, I have no water for you, but I can give you a beautiful tie. That is why I'm wearing this necktie." Well, the man says, "What am I going to do with a tie in the middle of the desert?" And the man on the camel says, "I'm sorry, sir," and rides away. Well, the next day, the same thing happens. The man is in the desert. A man on a camel comes up to him and says to him, "You look terrible, sir. How can I help you?" And the man says, "I need water. I need water." And the man on the camel says, "I don't have water, but I can give you a beautiful tie." And the man says, "What am I going to do with a tie in the middle of a desert?" And so the man on the camel rides away. Well, this happens on the third day as well. And finally, the man is at his wit's end. And remember, I told you, if you don't behave, I can make this joke last 3 days. Anyway, so The man is about to die, and all of a sudden he sees a sign, and the sign says oasis. So he thinks to himself, an oasis? What's that, an oasis? Water. So he crawls to the oasis, and he sees this beautiful hotel, and he starts climbing the steps to this hotel, and all of a sudden a man pops out of the door and says, I'm sorry, sir, you can't enter the hotel unless you're wearing a tie. Now, before you boo and groan, and I can hear the groans here, and I wish I could see your groaning faces, I never tell a joke unless there's a point to it. And in this joke, which I told every year at the beginning of my school year, there's a very important point. What does the tie represent? It represents the key to survival. And why doesn't the man take it? Well, because he doesn't know it's the key to survival. And what is it that our children should be thinking about as the key to their survival in this technological age? Education. The tie is education. And why don't they take it? Because we, the teachers, the parents, don't teach them how important it is. That is one of the reasons why I am here. I'm not here to get revenge or to show hate for the people who did these terrible things to us, but to educate people and to use the Holocaust as an example of genocide in the past, the future, and the present, unfortunately. My hope is that in doing this presentation, which is, in all honesty, is very, very difficult for me because I knew so little about my past, that I will be educating others so it never happens again to anyone. My story begins in hell, the gate of a ghetto. The Lodz ghetto was the second largest in Europe. Most people don't know about the Lodz ghetto. It's actually pronounced Budge, because of the fact they know about maybe the Warsaw ghetto, if they know anything at all. But the Lodz ghetto had 200,000 people in it, and yet it never had an uprising, which is what Warsaw did have. And one of the things that always puzzled me was why it did not have that uprising. The thing that is amazing really is that I knew almost nothing about the Lodz ghetto, which my parents miraculously survived. Most of my past is a mystery. This is the only photograph I have of any of my grandparents. Mom's grandmother and one of my mom's 5 brothers and sisters, actually 5 sisters. She had 2 brothers. An interesting thing about this picture is that it was on a postcard. And again, another mystery. This is a newly discovered postcard of Mom's sister, Minya. I never knew this beautiful child even existed. Let me go back. This is the only photo I have of another sister and Mom as a child. She's the little girl with the serious face. I wonder if she saw the future. These are my parents, Paula Isbicki and Isaac Newhouse. They changed their names a number of times, and so it was very difficult to trace them down. Auschwitz was liberated on January 27th, 1945. I was born on January 28th, 1947. So this picture is probably about 2 years or so after my parents were liberated. Notice how thin my mother's leg is. Notice how thin my father still is. This is where I believe I lived in Germany until my parents came to America in August of 1947. We believe it was a displaced persons camp. My father was a very interesting man. a very difficult person. I used him to model the mystery man in my novels, The Devil's Bookkeepers. He was brave, he was reckless, he loved women and they loved him. He was a ruthless businessman, very outspoken, very opinionated. Unfortunately, he was also violent. And in my book, there's a question which is, did he have an affair with his wife's best friend? Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of my dad is that he had an incredible drive to survive, and he was a perfectionist and a person who believed in excellence. He also believed that someday there would be a Holocaust here in the United States, and the only way to save ourselves was to get a great education and to get money. Mom married my father to escape Europe. After a stormy 20 years, they were divorced. When they came to America, they struggled as new immigrants. They did not have money. They were brought here by Hayas and were given a loan, which they had to repay. My father worked endlessly, was a very hard worker. Both of them struggled to learn English. This is one of the only pictures I have of my mother holding me in Germany. I'm not sure what this building is, but someone once pointed out that there are holes by the windows, which makes them think it was once covered with, the windows were once covered with bars, so it may have been some kind of a detention camp. We don't know. I honor my mother's memory with an only picture of me being held by her. She was my protector. As a child, I knew I was different. When we moved to Queens, a fifth grade teacher I had a wonderful idea. She wanted to have a grandparents' day. So she gave out colored paper and crayons and asked us all to make invitations. Well, I was a really good kid. And there I was at my desk, not doing anything. So my teacher, a young woman, came over to my desk and she said, "Mark, why aren't you making an invitation?" And I said, "I don't have grandparents." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "My grandparents were murdered." Well, of course, she was shocked. And she said, "What do you mean they were murdered?" And I said, "Well, they were murdered in the Holocaust." Well, she really didn't know what to say. Part of the reason was that the Holocaust was not part of the curriculum in fifth grade. And even today, it appears at the end of the school year. As a social studies teacher, it always bothered me that the Holocaust was at the very end of the school year. And unless you somehow moved it up, many teachers probably didn't get to it at all. My parents rarely spoke about their past. I think one reason was to protect us, but it was also because they had so many difficulties as immigrants and with themselves. Even though I knew very little about what they went through, it still gave me nightmares. This is a poem I wrote when I was about 14 years old. It's called The Blonde Angel. The Blonde Angel. The sight of an angel we long to see. Gossamer wings, gold, shimmery, promise hope and light where no hope can be. Guardian angels glowing bright are protectors day and night. Why do I see your hollow eyes stare? Black uniformed nightmare. My parents, grandparents saw an angel. They stood on endless lines with faceless others, brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, naked, heads shaved, holding their breath, being judged by the angel of death. Starched uniform, no silvery gown, blonde hair, no sparkling crown. Demon's smile, dripping guile. He held the key to life, finger deadly as a knife. Points in air. You've won, door one, to nothingness, nowhere. Grandparents sent to the door, disappear, see no more. Sent to unmarked graves. Mom, dad, made angel slaves. He sends them all to his darkest pits. In this hell he rules, Auschwitz. I dream of seeing angels in my nightmares. When you have nightmares like that, you don't ask a lot of questions. As I got older, I had the same concerns every other American kid has. We don't think of the fact that in this country we have so much freedom that we don't really think about the Holocaust as something that is a lesson for all of us as we grow up. I was interested in girls. I had to worry about the Vietnam War hanging over me. And then I became a teacher. And when I became a teacher, I created many, many crazy lessons for my students. I still have over 1,000 of my 5th grade and 6th grade students on Facebook with me after more than 22 years after I retired. So I think that's some kind of a Guinness World Record. Anyway, in 1989, I was recognized by the New York State Reading Association as Elementary Secondary Teacher of the Year. And Newsday, which was the 6th largest newspaper in the United States, came to my classroom and they wrote a story about me. And it was called Madcap Teacher Opens Books, Opens Minds. Well, I sent a copy to my mother and my mother called me up and said, Mark, and she always called me Maxilla, which means Little Max, which was my original name in Germany. She goes, Maxilla, madcap means you're crazy. Are you crazy? So I explained to my mother I was not crazy. Anyway, the following week, WPIX television from New York came to see me, and my students told the reporter that I wear a costume. Well, I didn't have any costumes in the classroom except a detective costume, which consisted of a trench coat. And I didn't play an instrument, but I played a kazoo. So there I am on this little clip, which came out very nicely. And my mother called me up about 11:30. And they showed me wearing this trench coat, playing a kazoo. My mother calls me up at about 11:30 and in her sweet Polish accent, she says, Maxla, last week I had to tell everybody you weren't crazy. This week I have to tell all my Yenta friends you're not a flasher. Anyway, I know you're all groaning at that one too. My mother was an amazing person. And I created many, many crazy lessons for my students. Writing was a way to solve my problems as a child. And it was my magic wand. I taught about the Holocaust to my students, but I really did not ask my parents what happened to them. I was so busy creating fictional monsters and fantasy folks based on my love of Perry Mason and Sherlock Holmes, and they won many awards. But I was so busy creating these fantasy monsters that I kind of forgot about the monsters in my past, the real monsters. And then my mom made a tape for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. She gave me a copy, and for several years, I did not look at it. Finally, a couple years later, my son, Keith, and I and my wife, Linda, watched it together. Most of the story was very familiar, but one sentence grabbed me. I wrote a story for a contest, and I was very, very proud that the warehouse won until I got the judge's comment. This is an amazing work of fiction. For 2 years, I was ashamed to show the story to my mother. Finally, on a visit to Miami, where she lived, I gave it to her in the last hour I was with her. When we got home, there was a message on my machine. Maxilla, Little Max, I love your story, but I wish you asked me for the facts before you wrote it. I was devastated. I sort of assumed that would happen. And I promised to come down the following month and interview her. I realized it should have been me and not a stranger interviewing my amazing mom. A month later, my wife and I were ready to go down to Miami in 2 days when my stepfather called. Your mom is in the hospital. Linda, my loving wife, and I raced to Miami. Mom passed away 10 minutes before I got there. I held Mom's hand and I cried. I lost my mother, and I also lost her story. So what was the sentence that she said that inspired my winning story? And then I wrote about it in a story called Legacy Lost as a winning entry for Tales to Inspire, another series. My mom said she worked in a warehouse, running her hands over clothing, checking hems and seams for valuables. I lost the story of how my mother, all 4'11" of her, delayed being sent to Auschwitz by sorting clothes of death camp victims. Nobody was left to tell me the true story of how she survived when so many did not. That is one of the reasons why I'm here, because I lost that story and don't want you or anybody else to lose their story. Not long after Mom passed away, I discovered that she had given me a monster of a book. I had put it in a thrift store pile, and then the cover opened and I saw it was addressed to my mom and autographed by the translator of the book. When I looked at the cover, I realized it was a chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto. I sat down on the floor and I began to read. And for the first time in my life, at age 70, I learned what my parents had gone through, what 200,000 people had gone through with only about 5,000 surviving. They were anonymous entries written by invisible men who have faded into history. They were recording the daily events that were happening in the Lodz Ghetto under the leadership of a man by the name of Rumkowski, whose policies today are even hotly debated. Nobody really knows whether he was a hero or whether he was the devil. As I was reading the novels, I kept saying to myself, I'm a children's writer. I can't write a novel about this. Excuse me, as I was reading the chronicle. But I felt I had to do something to make this chronicle well known. It was published by Yale University Press in 1984 and never published again. Up to the time I read this, I thought the Lodz Ghetto was like Anatevka in Fiddler on the Roof. Suddenly I realized that this was designed by the Germans as a way to kill Jews before they came up with the final solution. For the first time, I got a picture of what my parents, my lost relatives, and hundreds and thousands of men, women, and children and babies suffered in these ghettos that were all over Europe before being sent to the gas chambers. The leader was a man by the name of Chaim Rumkowski. His title was the eldest of the Jews. Even today, it is hotly debated whether he was a self-serving collaborator with the Nazis or whether he was a selfless man risking his life to save people like my parents. No one knows when he actually knew the final destination. And in my novel, the question comes up, what would you do? This is a painting of Rumkowski. In the background, you can see the most famous landmark of the Lodz Ghetto, which was the bridge the Germans built so that the Jews would not cross on the same streets as the Germans. You can see him here with children. And he was known and he promised to protect the children of the Lodz Ghetto. In our book, the hero of the book is an engineer by the name of Bernard Ostrowski. He is led into Deputy Rumkowski, into Neftalin, the deputy to Rumkowski, into the office, and he's fearful of being interrogated. I didn't know what to say. I didn't understand why I was here. Neftalin settled in his chair. Please sit. I organized the archives, or more formally, the Department of the Archives, a year ago. He shoved several folders aside and then flipped one open. I've studied your work registration. We are looking for someone who is highly organized and discreet. A job, sir? I hadn't worked since being forced into the ghetto 6 months earlier. Miriam, my young wife, would be ecstatic. Neftalin peered at me. You didn't answer my question. I'm sorry, sir. What was the question? Are you discreet? Are you someone we can trust? Strange question, I thought, squirming on the hard seat of the chair. Oh, yes, sir. I'm very trustworthy. Neftalin said, even if it means risking your life. What we don't understand today is these people who wrote the Chronicle were doing it in the same building as the Nazi ghetto administration. They were risking their lives every single day. Rumkowski created his own police force, and he used the police force to enforce the decrees of the Germans and to turn the ghetto into a manufacturing hub for the Nazis and the German military. This is a photograph of Rumkowski on a day that Himmler was supposed to come to the ghetto. Rumkowski and his staff waited for Himmler from 9 o'clock in the morning outside until 4:30 in the afternoon when Himmler finally arrived. Was he a collaborator? Was he the devil? He turned Lodge into an industrial supplier for the Germans. He employed children to keep them from being taken out of the ghetto. My dad lied about his age many times, and I always wondered why. Well, the reason was that you had to be a certain age to not be shipped out of the ghetto, because unless you could work, you were gone. Rumkowski believed that the worst thing that could happen would be for the Germans to interfere in the ghetto, which is why he enforced the German orders. Would he be successful? I never planned on writing a novel about the Holocaust. It just seemed overwhelming for me as a children's book writer, though I had won awards doing that, to think about writing about something I knew so little about. And I knew it would be a painful return to hell for me. A lot of research. As I read the Chronicle, it circled in my head that it was like 12 Angry Men, one of my favorite movies, where men are locked in a room debating the fate of another human being. And I couldn't stop visualizing, imagining what it would be like as these events unfolded for a group of men to have to write these entries. I decided that I really had no choice. At least my grandchildren had to know what I did not. The Germans used starvation, freezing cold, and disease to kill Jews before their final solution. They also used hope. One of the amazing things to me was, and again, it goes to that question of why the Jews of Lodz did not rebel, was the amount of hope that the Germans weaponized to keep the Jews calm and placated so they would not have to use so much manpower to control them. The chroniclers supported Rumkowski's efforts to keep the Nazis out. He believed it's the worst fate that could happen to the ghetto. The price of survival of the people in the Lodz ghetto was extremely high. On September 4th, 1942, Rumkowski gave a speech. The ghetto residents gathered in the town square, waiting for their leader to give them good news. This is from Book 2 in The Devil's Bookkeepers. The German soldiers were ringed around the perimeter. They were, as usual, armed. They reminded me of vultures, cold eyes staring down at the crowd, waiting for some signal to fly down and tear what little flesh we had left from our weary bones. The chairman removed his familiar hat, and the crowd, expectant, desperate for good news, fearing anything else, waited for him to begin. I always found his voice raspy, harsh, but its firmness comforting. Today, he seemed to be starting with an oddly restrained tone. A severe blow has befallen the ghetto, he said, and paused. They are asking from it the best it possesses, children and old people. The buzz was all around me. What was happening? I felt the shock, an earthquake. But what did it mean? Rumkowski waited for quiet and began again. I have not had the privilege to have a child of my own, and therefore I devoted the best of my years to children. I lived and breathed together with the children. I know you love children. Why are you repeating this? We believe you love children. What did you say before? It was a mistake. I heard wrong. The audience was silent, all eyes on the man in the tweed coat, who said, I never imagined that my own hands would have to deliver the sacrifice to the altar. Abraham was ordered by God to sacrifice his son on the altar. Sacrifice? Did everyone else hear what I was hearing? The voice on the microphone cracked with emotion. In my old age, I must stretch out my hands and beg, brothers and sisters, give them to me, fathers and mothers, give me your children. Does Rumkowski save the children? Ostrowski believes his Regina, his daughter, is protected by his work as a ghetto administrator. Will she be saved? What will young Miriam do when she learns of this demand that all children must be turned over? What did my parents do? What did so many do? If I had been born in the Lodz ghetto a few years earlier, I would not be here now to tell the story. Could Rumkowski's smooth running factories become so valuable to the Germans that would save the ghetto? My parents were among the few thousand who miraculously survived. I don't know how. Nobody knows when Rumkowski knew the final destination. What happened in the ghetto is not just about the past. It is happening in places like Ukraine today. The separation of families, the destruction of hope. These are universal themes that we should all care about. The Holocaust is not just about Jews. 6 million Jews were killed, but many undesirables were also killed. I was asked by one person a while back, what makes the Holocaust so different than all the other genocides that have taken place? Native Americans, Black Americans, so many other groups. And I had a hard time thinking about this, but I finally came up with what I think is an answer. One, it was a state-sponsored genocide, unprecedented in history. It mechanized the extermination of civilians. It took place in so few years that it's almost impossible for our hero in the book to even imagine, to contemplate that something like this is even logistically possible. It wasn't murder, it was extermination. And there was one more factor that really we overlook. And my engineer really is sort of like my point of view in this. It was illogical. The Lodz Ghetto was producing supplies for the German military. Hitler was in a world war, but his hate was so rabid and illogical that even the Lodz Ghetto eventually was no more. When did Rumkowski know? When did the chroniclers know? The only clue I was able to discover, which appears in my books, were truckloads of shoes, heels and soles missing, that arrived in the ghetto. I think that is when Rumkowski and the others finally began to realize what was happening. Filled with doubt, but haunted by these shocking events, I sat down at my computer and I wrote 700 pages in about 30 days. I was exhausted, I was emotionally drained, but it was as if my lost relatives were writing the books through me. I knew I should have used exciting, flashy covers on my books, but I decided to use Mom's lost sister's beautiful face for the cover of my novel of undying love and suspense that follows the true events of the Lodz Ghetto. There is no tombstone, there is no marker, no memorial for my family. Nobody was more shocked than I was when book one, The Noose, won the gold medal historical fiction, and then the top honor, Book of the Year from the Florida Writers Association. I think it's a wonderful thing that a book about the Holocaust can win approval in an age when there's so much escapist, entertainment novels with flashy covers. For book, I think this is book two, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, for book two, which won a silver medal the following year, I decided to use the picture of my mom, who had passed away, unfortunately, and will never be able to read my books, which are a tribute to her. And in book three, I decided to use this picture of this beautiful child that was one of my mom's sisters who I never even knew existed. I don't understand how anyone could hurt a child. Book three won a silver medal for historical fiction and also won first place historical fiction in the Eric Hoffer International Book Awards, was named first place winner in the Top Shelf Magazine Awards, and also won a silver medal this year in the Florida Authors and Publishers Awards. And I used this picture as the model of Regina, Ostrowski and Miriam's child. Can anyone save the beautiful children is a constant theme in my books and should be our theme as we look at what's going on in the world today. I was shocked when this series won the grand prize fiction series in an international competition. When I saw the covers of the other books and I saw how entertaining and how enticing they were, this was a complete shock to me. And once again, I was so grateful that a book about the Holocaust could be recognized in this way. What really touches my soul and brings tears to my eyes are the emotional reviews that I've been getting for the books that tell me I did something that touches hearts and souls and makes the Holocaust experience real for people who may not ever read the actual chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto. I decided, based on this experience and as my experience as a teacher, that I had to write another book. This is called My Family Secret, The Holocaust, and it's a young adult novel where a boy becomes a detective to find out how his family was murdered 60 years earlier. It's based on a true incident, and I'm proud to say it won a silver award from the Florida Writers Association and just was given a bronze award from the Florida Authors and Publishers Association. The best revenge against the Nazis, I think, is our children. This is a picture of Keith, my wonderful son, who wrote a book called My Tio's Pulse. It was inspired by the Pulse Massacre, and it is a book that is being used to help children deal with violent tragedies that are happening too often in our world today. Nothing made me prouder than Keith receiving his award the same night that I received my gold medal. So I think that he's my proudest product. And I'm honored that he's here with us today. What amazes me about Keith, I guess it's the acorn not falling far from the tree, is that this is the first book he's ever done. And he was able to get a number of artists from Orlando to donate their artwork to this project. And all profits are donated to charity, to worthy causes. So yes, I'm extremely proud of him. A few years ago, I was asked to speak at Kristallnacht at my temple, and I wrote this poem, which I would like to share with you. Kristallnacht, for those who may not know, many consider the official start of the Holocaust. It took place on November 9th, 1938. Kristallnacht is broken glass. Broken glass. They shattered the glass, and so it starts. They attacked our past. They could not kill our hearts. They lit up the night with cries of hate, but could not extinguish the light of our faith. They tried to crush us under their heels, but we survived because of God's will. 1,000 synagogues they ruthlessly burned as mobs rampaged with hatred learned, setting fire to our shops, beating those they might meet. A night of murder in the hate-darkened streets. A night heralding a longer night of fear, our cries falling on the world's deaf ears. The death camps opened their poisonous hands, and the hate flowed freely in many lands. November 9th, 1938, an explosion of unchecked hate. The Kristallnacht that heralded the long December, a night of rage we must remember. 6 million more stars soared into the sky, and still the flame of our faith would not die. The light of our beliefs we hold dear, our heritage from the past, even as once again we hear the frightening echoes of broken glass. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey today. I hope that it is a message of hope and love and a tribute to everyone who suffered during the Holocaust, to my parents, to my lost relatives, and to everyone who suffers hate and genocide, past, present, and future. I also hope that it inspires you to write your stories before you lose your stories the way I lost mine. Your story is the legacy that is the most important gift you can give to your children and future generations. That is why I am here sharing my story with you today. And I thank you so much for allowing me to do that.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was really just so moving and so incredible. And of course, for many of us, we have a personal connection. I have a huge personal connection because my grandmother survived the Lodz ghetto the entire time. So your books shed a lot of light on that experience. So I'm a huge fan myself, and very honored that I had the chance to welcome you and speak with you. So I'd love to get started. I would love for you to tell us what you're currently working on, because I know there's some exciting projects coming. So can you share that? And then we'd love to invite Keith to join us as well.
Well, we recently we recently issued the audiobooks of the Devil's Bookkeepers series. And that's kind of an interesting story because I don't do too many of these presentations because it really is draining for me. And I still have a tremendous amount of guilt. But someone came up to me and said, you know, Mark, the survivors that are left, many can't read any longer. And the veterans who rescued them, many of them can't read. So I thought about that and I said, I don't care what it costs. I want to do an audio book for those who can't read any longer. And so we hired a wonderful actor, Louis B. Jacks, and he has done an amazing job on the books. And I'm very proud of them. And they are available on Amazon now. And now what we're working on, and this is sort of top secret, is we're actually working on the pilot script for a limited series. I'm not someone who can just sit around and watch television and play golf. I've got to always challenge myself. And this is the toughest thing I've ever had to do.
Incredible. We're looking forward to seeing that work. That's really remarkable. Remarkable. So one area that we are always interested in discussing is sort of the intergenerational transmission. As we discussed, you mentioned that you have, feelings of guilt, is the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you became an activist and also how that transmitted to Keith becoming so passionate about becoming an activist. I think there's a study that shows that second generation Holocaust survivors tend to be more engaged in the world around them. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
I always felt very, very lucky to be alive. The only way I learned about the Holocaust is kind of interesting because my parents, as I said, I had a very difficult childhood. I didn't have grandparents to talk to. The only way I learned about things was when my parents were with their immigrant friends. They would speak in Polish and Yiddish and some German. They did not know that I understood a lot of what they were saying. So I would pick up snippets from them. But it really wasn't the best way of learning about it because it scared the heck out of me. And as I show, I wrote a number of poems from the time I was about 12 to the time I was about 15 that captured that fear. The one I read you about the blonde angel is a good example of how I felt in those days. So I didn't really have that kind of, I guess, curiosity. I was more afraid than anything else. And when my parents got divorced, things were very, very tough. And with the Vietnam War hanging on me, that was really my main concern, okay? I was always an idealist. And when I was teaching, the first rule of my class was be kind. And in fact, I would always tell them this dumb tie joke. And every Christmas and birthday, guess what I got as presents? Ties. When I retired, I had over 300 ties from my students. But I always taught them kindness. And I thought that was more important than math and science or anything else I could teach them. And I think that's what my son learned. Both of my sons learned that. I have another son who lives in Massachusetts, who is a wonderfully kind person. And he's extremely active in civil rights causes and in getting, I guess, equal rights for all people, which is what I believe in.
Incredible. Incredible legacy, really remarkable. So as parents in this day and age, and you being an educator and a parent, how do we move forward with ensuring that the next generation understands their role in sort of the legacy, in the stream of legacy? You were years in the classroom, and what can teachers do? What can parents do to ensure that this important work survives?
That's a very tough question because, as I said, in most textbooks, the Holocaust comes at the end of the school year. And that's really unfortunate. What I used to do was I used to bring books about the Holocaust into school, and I used them in my reading classes. One of my favorites was Number the Stars Many people know about the Diary of, the Diary of Anne Frank. They don't usually read that in the early grades. I think one thing that has to be done is that we have to stop thinking of the Holocaust as only impacting Jews and as only something in the past. I view it as one of the most amazing examples of what can happen when a government goes wrong, when people hate, when, I guess, of any genocide. And I'm reminded too much by things that are happening in the world today, in Ukraine, in Africa, in China, even in the United States, that lessons should have been learned from the Holocaust that we obviously haven't learned.
Excellent. And we have a question about why do you think Holocaust education is at the end of the year? Is there something we can do to shift it to earlier in the year? Were you able to, when you were a teacher, put a different focus on it? I can tell you from my days in education, one of the areas that I'm passionate about is making sure that Holocaust is not just a lesson in the history books, but that there's ways to incorporate it into civics, into art classes, into music classes. There's so many different areas that we can broaden that into. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I'll never forget, I once had a principal who asked me an interesting question. He said, every sixth grade teacher is working with the same textbook, and they all start with prehistoric people. And then they go to Egypt, and then they went to Rome and to Greece. He said, you're starting with contemporary history. Why are you doing that? Well, I gave him two answers. One is the book is 600 pages long and we'll never get through all of it. So I, as a classroom teacher, have to feel empowered to pick what I think is important. And then I gave him the clincher, which was that in New York State, in all the years I'd been teaching, I had never seen one question on any Regents exam or on any state test about prehistoric people and their contributions to world culture. So my answer is that we as teachers have to find ways of taking current events and implanting them earlier in the year. And I think we as parents have to not abdicate our role as teaching about current events and the real important things of history. History is not about dead people. It's not about events that happened 80 years ago. It's how those events still impact us today. When we look at things like Ukraine, or we look at things like what's going on in Russia and even in China, it all follows a chain of events. And I'm not comparing the Holocaust to any other event, but what I'm saying is that unless we understand the past, we are doomed to repeat it. And that's what our children have to understand.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And we'd love to invite Keith to join us if he would like to. So we can have.
I'd love to see him, yeah.
Yeah, let's see if we can have the magic of the internet work and have Keith join us. Perfect.
I don't know, there seems to be some problem. Okay. I'll have to hold the fort by myself.
No, we're going to have him join us. Hold on one second.
I'm here. It just says I don't have permission for the camera.
Keith, we'd love to welcome you and hear about your experience having a father who's such an inspiration and how you turn that into action. That's the most important thing.
It's always been wonderful. Like he said, he's always taught me to be a kind person. And we've always, I can remember as a child on Thanksgiving, we would go help out at the soup kitchen. And no problem, Lauren. We'd always go help out at the soup kitchen, feed the homeless there. I can remember doing that even at like age, what, 6 or 7, Dad?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's always been, like
something...
you said, we've always felt very lucky in life. I'm terrible at bingo. I'm terrible at raffles. I have no luck in those things, but in life, I've been very lucky. And I've always felt like I want to give back because of that. So that's where I used to do a lot of volunteer work with the American Cancer Society, with the Second Harvest Food Bank, with local arts organizations. And Dad and I started our publishing company together so that we could give back in a bigger way.
That's remarkable. We're so grateful that you have. And of course, the Pulse Massacre is very near and dear to our heart as we're in Orlando. So we're thrilled that you're such an active part of the community. And I have a question for your dad and also for you, Keith. One of our guests is visiting us from the UK, and they would like to know if you've ever visited your parents' hometown in Poland or the ghettos or camps.
I have not yet. What's that?
No, I have not. To be very honest with you, for most of my life, the Holocaust has been a terrifying shadow. And I really couldn't talk about it with my father. That was a major problem. You have to remember, we did not have that kind of a relationship that we could really do that. And my mother, on the other hand, she was driven to survive. She ended up being the first female liberationist. She fought my father tooth and nail for the right to drive,
Wow.
to fight, to go to work. He didn't want her to work. And she went and got a job for herself. She ended up owning a travel agency. She ended up having 3 homes. One was in Florida. She married another Holocaust survivor who was a wonderful man. And that's an interesting thing too, something I've learned. Everybody, whether they were survivors of the Holocaust or whether they were children of Holocaust survivors, had different experiences. Okay, I belong to a number of groups that talk about the Holocaust. And what I've seen is that some of the people who survived the Holocaust never talked to the children about it. I mean, never. I don't know whether it was to protect them or because they were too busy or whether they prayed it would never happen again. Others imbued them with an understanding of what the Holocaust was like.
Yeah.
And it's been very interesting to me to see the different reactions. Will I ever go to Poland? My dad tried to reclaim property in Poland, and he was denied the right to claim that property. We knew of a number of families that did go back to Poland, and they were beaten up, some were killed. Things have changed, but Poland has taken a policy now where you're not even allowed to say that it's a Polish ghetto. You have to say it is a ghetto that was in Poland. It's against the law to say that it was a Polish ghetto. Poland is saying that they were victims of the Holocaust, and in many cases they were. But there was also some evidence that many Polish people were complicit in the anti-Jewish, pogroms that appear in my books.
Yeah, you raise an excellent point, Mark. I've done a lot of work with Poland and taken many trips there, and it is a very complex history, as is much of the Holocaust, because there also had the most number of righteous Gentiles in Poland as well. So it's always, as are many of these topics, they're complex, and we're so grateful that we have such remarkable individuals to help us unravel that complexity. And in many cases, it ends up being the children or grandchildren of survivors who end up carrying this torch. And so we are so grateful that, Mark, that you have dedicated so much of your life to ensuring that the legacy of your family continues. And really also a huge thank you to Keith for the incredible work that you're doing. And we look forward to being engaged in this work. The website is located right here. So please continue the remarkable work that you're doing. And we're so grateful to both of you, and we're so grateful to all of you who joined us today to hear this incredible presentation. And as you said, Mark, in beautiful words, we go and we teach from hope to hope, because that's really the most important part, is to share the message of hope and to make the past connect with contemporary issues. So we're extremely grateful, and we're looking forward to hearing about your future projects and to hosting you once again at the center. So thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
you.
It was an honor.